troubles in anesthesia departments are like storms. And they're like storms because oftentimes you could see them well in advance, particularly in their nascence. Number two, early and ongoing evaluation often mitigates bad outcomes, and that's because you could prepare. And the impact of a surgical program, like a storm, can be quite severe. We're going to cover this multiple different ways. So one way we're going to look at this are the early warning signs. And these are some of the very early things you'll start to see. Your surgeon satisfaction, nursing, and patient satisfaction, KPIs, start to approach this B level, B plus level. Your anesthesia staff satisfaction, that is harmony among the group, satisfaction with the way the group is working internally, starts to take a further reduction under 75%. And things like your OPP, FPP, SCIP, HCAHPS data begins to show some decrements. Maybe it's not being done, or maybe it's getting too late. You'll also start to see retraction of engagement on hospital committees and avoidance of CXO interactions. But things don't happen that way out of the blue. So let's talk a little bit about that. Before we do, remember, one look, like as with anything else in life, one look is a snapshot in time. It's just not helpful. In our business, it usually requires 2 or 3 readings. If you get one reading and it's completely aberrant and things are just not good, you do have to act. You have a responsibility to your surgeons and patients to act quickly. But oftentimes you'll have the luxury of getting 2 or 3 different reports over, let's say, a 6 or 9 month period to see if a trend is evolving. And the most important thing I want to share is a lot of times is I find that most of the hospital executives I meet with, and over the course of a year that could be 100 or more, the data is often they talk themselves out of it. This is not good at all, but this isn't so good. However, there's always a but, however, maybe not. And it's interesting because when the data is really, really good, on the other end of the spectrum, I never hear that. It's always the stuff that has issues that isn't very good where it tends to get dismissed. And my advice to almost every hospital executive I work with is, it's okay to put it in perspective and say it's one reading, but just don't discount it. So let's talk about trajectory. And if we start to take a look about complaints, that's one way to start to gauge when you should start to take a look at trajectory. And look, I know surgeons seldom complain and nurses seldom complain, but when they do, and you're starting to get complaints from the usual suspects, generally speaking, we discount that. Oh, Dr. Jones, she's a complainer. Dr. So-and-so, he's always lamenting. This nurse is always, complaining about this or that. You shouldn't necessarily act on that then and there, but in the back of your head, it should start to put your antennas up about thinking. What happens next is you start to get complaints from the unlikely or the unusual suspects. It's the people that seldom complain. They're usually easygoing. We have plenty of surgeons like that we meet and plenty of nurses, but you start to hear them complaining. That's when you start to adjust the gain on your antenna a little bit to the right. Then you start to have complaints from the complainers and the non-complainers. And then finally, as the storm hits landfall, you begin to have a large number of complaints from anyone and everyone. Patients, happy surgeons, unhappy surgeons, all start to levy complaints. The other way you'll start to see things going awry is with trajectory is as it comes to scheduling and scope of service. The first thing, which doesn't sound unusual, it's friction. I want to do this case at 4 o'clock. Okay, it's 4 o'clock. We'll do the case, but some people will say, no, it's 4 o'clock. I got here at 7. It's past 3. I want to go home. Again, there are anesthesiologists from time to time, for whatever the reason they may say that. Not something to go crazy about, but keep your antenna up. When you start to have friction with weekends or evening cases, that's what you'll start to see next. I don't want to do this case at 6 o'clock. I don't want to do this case, it's Saturday morning, and it's hard. You start to hear friction and more friction. The next thing I'll typically hear is emergencies get scheduled, are questioned. Well, it's an open fracture, but the OR opens in 3 hours, and it's a hot gallbladder. But if there's just a little bit more questioning than you would expect. That doesn't mean cases don't get done. It doesn't mean that patients are necessarily going to have a bad outcome, but you just find that they're being questioned more and more. And then finally, what you're going to see, just as this thing takes on a head of steam, is routine scheduling begins to get problematic. I.e., geez, I used to be able to do my case no problem during my block time. Now I can't do it. There was a 1 week lag to do my cases electively. Now I have to wait 2 or 3 weeks. That's one of the final elements you'll see just before things start to get fairly bad. There's something that we call being a good citizen. And part of being a good citizen involves involvement and engagement in hospital activities. So a typical trajectory as a department begins to have functional disability is that the anesthesiology folks will oftentimes go from happily sitting on committees, P&T, trauma, pharmacy, OR steering, whatever the committees are in your hospital. And then you start to see they can't attend. This guy's got a ball game, this one's got a tennis lesson, whatever it is, there starts to be more reasons why they can't attend. And you can't really put your finger on it, but they just can't make it. And then you start to see retraction of involvement. That eagerness, that alacrity to take on projects or be a vibrant member of a committee begins to be retracted and constricted. And then finally there's disengagement. They just don't show up, there's no excuses, they're not involved, and that again is a fairly terminal part of the trajectory. Now, sometimes if you begin to take a look at the indicators, you could prepare for the worst case scenario. And again, as I'm going to get into in a few slides, the best thing you could possibly do is if you see a problem very early on, you could sit down with the chief of anesthesia, you could sit down with the head anesthetist, and you could work it out and say, look, we're having some issues here. Let's work it out so everybody's okay. That is the most prominent and good goal that could be reached, always. And part of my goal in being here today is to give everybody who would apply to some tools so they could try to solve these problems before the storm hits landfall and before things can become problematic. But if we're talking about preparedness and why that is important, sometimes the indicators could help you think about how to prepare. If there's some feet stomping and sand kicking about a higher subsidy, you have to think about that. Because if you don't, and you don't start to prepare, when that contract comes due, if you haven't solved it, it's going to become high noon. And if you're a hospital executive, it's going to be one of these situations where you either have to pay what subsidy is being demanded, or you're going to have to go through a very difficult time. Similarly, from the anesthesia group, this is your time too. I mean, if you have additional staff, additional scope, and you need to request a higher subsidy, again, you shouldn't approach that on the eve of your contract renegotiation. That should be an evolving discussion. If the quality is not up to market and you don't address it early on, and it kind of manifests later in the trajectory, you're going to start to see poor skip measures. You're going to start to see impacts to your value-based purchasing payments. If you start to have issues with patient satisfaction, surgeon satisfaction, nursing satisfaction, whomever, and you don't prepare, eventually your HCAP scores are going to become poor, your surgeons are going to become unhappy, they're not going to want to bring their cases, and your volume is going to tank. If you ignore the unhappy surgeons, and again, if it's the usual complainers, your antenna should still go up, but if it's the usual happy folks, you want to start to pay a little bit more careful attention. If you don't, and you just let this evolve, what's going to happen is your surgeon will have a critical mass of being unhappy. You'll have poor harmony in the operating room. You're going to start to have passive-aggressive behavior, and there'll be angst with and for administration. As a hospital administrator, if you start to see this trajectory, the key thing you should do is you should start meeting and talking with people. That's the most critical thing. And it's not just the anesthesia group. The anesthesia group should be the first person on the list because you want to start to solve these problems early before they snowball. But you want to meet with your surgeons one-on-one. Everything from the seldom booking podiatrist to the heavy booking orthopedist. Everybody, meet with as many of them as you can and have it be an open-ended conversation. Ask them how the anesthesia department's doing, how the operating room is running, and so forth. Meet with your nurses. Your nurses have their ear to the tracks, they have their thumb on the pulse, use whatever analogy you want, but they oftentimes have a very good sense about what's going on. And that also includes the scheduler. Meet one-on-one with the members of the anesthesia department. That includes the chief, of course, the section heads, of course, but your CRNAs and your anesthesiologist, ask them how things are going. One-on-one in a confidential forum, ask them. And finally, read and review the minutes from your nursing meetings, your surgical OR, steering committee meetings, and other meetings to get a sense of what the tone is of the operating room. Now, again, these things, if you look carefully and you watch carefully, they won't spring up on you all of a sudden, and it allows you to think. If you start evaluating things on an ongoing basis, on a quarterly basis, for instance, you're going to have a really good sense about where things are going early on. My recommendation is if you're not sure, and let's say you see all of these different metrics all pointing in the direction that the storm is going to hit, it's going to hit landfall and it's going to cause some damage, you really have a fiduciary responsibility to both the patients, your surgeons, your anesthesia group, and the hospital to begin to explore other options. That doesn't mean you go with them. Again, you try to solve the problems with what you have. It's always a good rule of thumb. Nevertheless, it's 18 months out. That's not a typo. 18 months out, start to assemble your RFP committee. Okay, don't make this a behind your back process with your anesthesia group. It's fairly appropriate to say to them, look, there are some elements of performance we've been very concerned with. We've asked you to try to make some positive, constructive changes. We haven't seen it. This is 18 months out. It's still time to make positive, productive changes and fix it. But I have to have enough lead time so if you don't fix it, that I have options at my avail. So at 18 months out, you should assemble a committee. 12 months out, you should issue RFP. 10 months out, you should be interviewing your finalists and some putative choices made. 9 months out, you should assemble and charge a transition team. 8 months out, you should make a formal announcement of staying with your current group or picking your new anesthesia team. And 6 months out, prepare for recruitment and retention activities. Most important thing, I can't tell you the number of hospitals that call us and say, we'd like you to apply for RFP. Well, that's really not what I like to do. I'm willing to help hospitals that have a hurricane that's about to hit or has hit. But, I'm not here to act as a lever for, their incumbent group. And I'll have a very honest conversation with them. And, I always tell them the same thing. I mean, RFP doesn't obligate you to make a change, but it really does obligate you to be honest to both your group, to your group and other people you're interviewing and talking with. So, can you predict a bad storm? Absolutely. Absolutely. Of the 100 or so hospital executives I meet with every year, they all say the same thing. Geez, I should have seen this coming. If I only had thought about it a little bit more, I could have seen it. If we want to try to now enumerate some of these warning signs, one of them is clinical inefficiency and ineffectiveness. That oftentimes distills down to increased case cancellations, reduced on-time starts, typo, pardon me, increased turnover time, passive management of add-ons, increased problems with nausea, vomiting, or post-op pain, and anecdotal quality and safety concerns are becoming more of a pattern than an episodic experience. Number two, there's discord and disconnect. They're not coming by the hospital executive suite as much as they used to. They're not meeting with the chief nursing officer, the chief executive officer, the chief medical officer. The VPMA looks at his calendar to see the last time he met with the section head of whatever or the chief of anesthesia. As I mentioned before, committee involvement is less robust. Surgeons have this general tone of where the anesthesia staff just isn't available as much as they used to be. The nurses lament the lack of support. Oh, geez, you know, they had a trauma coming in and there were 2 rooms going and I really needed them to step up and give me some leadership on how I balance that with 2 nursing teams, and they weren't there. Oftentimes, you know, one of the signs of discord and discontent is late to arrive and early to leave. You know, that's typically a sign that they're starting to sort of check out. Doesn't mean you shouldn't intervene. It's a good time to intervene and say, let's talk about things you could do to improve the situation. But it's, again, this is a warning sign. And one of the things that is unequivocally not a good sign is infighting. This anesthesiologist is saying something about this one. She's talking about that one. It's a situation where the harmony has been lost. And that has reached the sense of consciousness to your surgeons and administration. Customer dissatisfaction. You're going to start to see, as I mentioned, erosion of your HCAP scores. And I assume everybody in the room know what HCAPS is. If not, I'm happy to go over that. You'll see a volume shift to competing arenas. Maybe they're bringing more cases to the ASC. Maybe Dr. So-and-so is bringing cases to his office-based surgery suite. Maybe they're bringing cases to the other hospital. The OR scheduler and the surgeon booking staff begin to complain. I can't get his cases in. I can't get her cases in. And as I mentioned before, normally happy surgeons turn dissatisfied. All of those are signs of customer dissatisfaction. Administrative problems. There was a group of CEOs I met with in Massachusetts. I must have met with 24 in 2 weeks. I mean, it all went to hell in a handbasket in that state. It went, wow, I've never seen something like this. The initial signs of that were that the group was not being paid timely. They were missing paychecks. They were being underpaid. Their med mal, no payment notices were getting picked up. It were these issues that really, you'd have to ask the anesthesia group. You'd have to really delve into it. But that was one of the first presenting signs that things were wrong. The other way you could look at this is if you ask the group to share with you their records about case counts. If their case counts for OB, cardiac, pain, whatever, do not equal your OR systems case counts or your information system case counts, and there's a disconnect, chances are there's some pretty significant administrative issues that are brewing. Revenue's being lost, and that can manifest as staffing issues and an inability to pay the bills. Retention of providers and succession planning in case people have to leave or go to part-time, you know, those are other administrative problems that you could start to see. Again, although a late sign, it's a pretty sensitive sign. If you start to see that the group has all their senior guys or gals go to the ASC down the road, you find out that some of the senior guys are covering the pain center or the GI suite up the road. If you start to see those things start to happen, if you start to see your MD-CRNA ratios where it go from 1 to 2, 1 to 3, now to 1 to 4, and you say, well, where'd all the docs go? Well, all the docs are covering the ASC up the road. You know, those are pretty sensitive indicators that you may be having issues. In addition, the switchboard may start to see a lot of calls for your anesthesia department. And those are recruiters, by the way. Those are recruiters calling because they heard there's problems in the group. And finally, your nurses may say, oh, I got a call from Hospital X 3 miles up the road. I got a call from Surgery Center Y 2 blocks up the street. Well, they got queries to see how good the anesthesia group is because they're starting to plan for their own contingency because they know things aren't going very well. Now, sure, they may be entrepreneurial and maybe they want to cover this and that center. Of course they could. Of course they could. In fact, that's probably the most likely case scenario. But you shouldn't take it for granted and you should ask. So, why evaluate your anesthesia services? And this isn't a one-time stop. This is on a quarterly basis in a regimented, structured way. Whether it's FPPPE, OPPE, HCAP, SCIP, monitoring this quarterly, quarter after quarter, is important. It'll allow you to see if there's problems early on so you don't need to get to the situation where things have gone poorly and you need to make a change. You could work with the current group and work it out. Always the best outcome. It gives you a leg up with preparedness and contingency planning. And by the way, that's for you as a hospital executive and also for your anesthesia group. Look, sometimes it doesn't work. That's it. It doesn't work. Okay? That could be something intrinsic to the hospital. It could be something intrinsic to the group. It could be a little bit of both. In any eventuality, you need to make a contingency, and so do they. By having an ongoing early evaluation, you can mitigate any potential for being backed into a corner as the contract comes due. And as I mentioned time and time again, even for very well-run departments, this evaluative process often identifies areas where you could take something that's really good and make it great. And that's something that would be very positive that comes out of this evaluative process. That includes leadership, quality management, financial management, clinical service delivery, and these are just examples of things that could come out of it. Well, and also this ongoing evaluative process gives you as a hospital executive and your anesthesia group a time to go over all the good things they've done, all the advantages they've brought to the hospital, and allows you to constructively work on taking oftentimes what's good and making it great. Now, people ask me, well, how do we evaluate some of these qualitative aspects like sound leadership? Well, and I just listed a few things here, and these aren't my words. This isn't the world according to Marc. This has just come from talking with anesthesiologists who run successful departments. It comes from meeting with hospital executives who have good departments. And some of the things they'll tell me is that good leadership means leading by example, having some alacrity to your job, and being proactive, keeping the trains running on time, deal with small issues before they mushroom into big ones, have a very broad, a very deep data experience where data is being collected, aggregated, analyzed, assessed, and presented, involvement in hospital activities, and some degree of contingency and succession planning. What I mean by that is everybody at one point retires. I mean, everybody does, you know? I mean, Bob Woodward's still a reporter, a journalist, and someday he'll retire. Everybody one day is going to want to scale back a little bit. You have to plan for that. Maybe Martha is out because she's having a child, or maybe Bob is out because he has a family issue. You have to have some contingency planning. And leadership means taking that into account. Examples of quality improvement. You know, we've been doing quality improvement for going on 17 years, since 1996, when quality improvement was it was small q, small I. Nowadays, you know, geez, it's almost 20 years later, quality management is its own discipline. And, you know, what we've heard in taking a look what we've done, what the government is looking to see, and what some of the quality organizations are working on include things like OPPE, FPPE, HCAP, SCIP, and then just your run-of-the-mill surgeon, nursing, and patient satisfaction. It's a discipline. Sometimes it's a religion. But at the very least, quality management is something that's critically important to every single department and every single hospital. As part of that includes risk management and compliance. Examples of good financial management, again, not my words. You know, talking with hundreds of CEOs facing some pretty catastrophic issues with anesthesia and hearing what they feel would constitute a big improvement is they want to know a little bit more about how revenue is being generated. And that's meant in a broad sense. Is the group thinking about starting a pain service? Yeah, there's pros and cons to that, I got it. But are they talking about it? Have they spoken about increasing the service lines to include covering areas in the hospital like pediatric radiology or pediatric oncology or other areas? Have they presented some elements on cost of service? I mean, look, you know, we all have our metrics, right? And for me, I like to take a look at cost per unit, revenue per unit. But you could cut and splice it many different ways. The bottom line is, to have that intelligent discussion with their anesthesia group and let it be an ongoing dialogue. Discussion of what we call a triad: payer contract, scope of service, and subsidy. Collaborative determination of subsidy. An honest and forthright discussion about subsidy. It's just not realistic today to not have a subsidy. It is a physical impossibility with the ambulatory surgery center space and the office-based space taking out all of the patients with better insurance, with minor procedures. We all know this. What remains in the hospital is a lot of Medicare, Medicaid, and charity cases. That's just the reality of it. This is happening in front of the backdrop where the provider census, in terms of supply and demand, is adverse. The demand for anesthesiologists is significantly higher than the supply, causing an increase in compensation across the board for CRNAs and anesthesiologists. Therefore, not having the discussion of subsidy and putting your head in the sand is not going to make it go away. So the best anesthesia groups will have an ongoing dialogue with their administration, explaining what they're doing to manage their cost of service, explain what they're doing to manage their revenue per service, and have this be an ongoing dialogue and a discussion. If the scope is increasing and you need to hire more people, or the scope is constricting and you could have some people go to part-time, are we doing that? Is the hospital and the anesthesia group working together? If they are, then you have pretty good financial management. As hospital executives also understand there's more than the 2008 MGMA compensation statistics. When I or Somnia prices out positions, we use 5 or 6 different databases, and we have formal consultants that help us price our positions. And I will tell you that the compensation is oftentimes it's high. And hospitals I meet with find that to be somewhat of an eye-opening experience. Back in 1996, the starting comp for an anesthesiologist was somewhere between $90 and about $1.25, $1.40. Okay, today, most of the anesthesiologists coming out of training that we hire are coming in at north of $300,000. Yeah, it's been 15 years, but it's still a fairly significant increase. And if you take a look at the increase in unit rates and payer contracts, they certainly haven't kept pace with that. What's an example that I've heard from hospital executives of really good clinical service provision? Is the OR coverage consistent? Are the ratios of MDs and CRNAs optimized? Can they flex up or flex down based upon staffing needs? Do they manage the add-ons actively, proactively, preemptively? Or they take a more passive, okay, we'll put them in this room, and that makes a difference. It builds confidence with the surgeons, and it builds confidence with the nurses. It helps reduce your OT costs for your nurses, and it keeps the surgeons happy as well. How could you expand scope? Can they expand scope on an hour, daily, weekly, annual basis? Every hospital is different, but your ability to adroitly increase scope is important today, especially when hospitals are trying to recruit more and more surgeons. So my takeaway, and I'm sorry if I speak quickly, I'm from New York, and that's how most of us speak, and I apologize for that. Evaluating your anesthesia group is not a discrete point in time. It's an ongoing process. Quarterly, semi-annually, either way, it's got to be done on an ongoing basis. If your data does not look good, that doesn't mean you discount it. It doesn't mean that you bury it. You monitor it, and you follow it, and you track and you trend it. Preparedness always equates to contingency planning, but it also means a collaborative discussion with your anesthesia group early on. Now, I'm going to open it up to questions for anybody that has any, and shoot away. If I don't know, I'll tell you, but if I do know, I could share some of my experiences with y'all.
What are your thoughts on hospitals employing anesthesiologists?
Well, hospitals are experts at at running hospitals. And my view is that if you really want to get very granular as it pertains to managing a good anesthesia group, you want to have people with anesthesia experience. So, there's a bunch of management companies that focus on ER and pediatrics and other specialties. If you have a single issue with anesthesia, I would probably go to a company that focuses more on the anesthesia, and I probably would go away from the strategy of doing it yourself. Optimization of revenue, cost containment on expenses, putting together the right policies, procedures, and protocols. It really takes more than a hospital could bring to bear. And I've seen the best outcomes when hospitals don't do it. Now, by the way, just to qualify what I just said, of course, if you have problems with ER, radiology, pediatrics, and anesthesia, well, there are companies that deal with all of those, and they're very good. But if you have a solo anesthesia problem, you're probably better to go with the group that focuses on it. Yes, gentleman back there, yeah.
My question is regarding, you talked about the compensation model, compensation, and at what level the anesthesiologists are in the current market. There's been a big push recently where a single specialty or the multi-specialty national groups are coming into market, especially Chicago and some of the other cities, and coming in, and as you mentioned, not too many hospitals now can do without stipends. Not anesthesia departments, not too many anesthesia departments can do without stipends. But these national groups are coming in and saying, we're going to take on these hospitals without a stipend. We're going to give you the services that you need, but at the end of the day, it's the individual anesthesiologists who are, essentially given the choice. You work for less, you work for our company, because now we have the contract. And so in that type of a scenario, really is the hospital benefiting? Is the national corporation benefiting? Because it seems clear that the anesthesiologist is not.
Well, management of an anesthesia department isn't free. So whether it's the hospital doing it, or whether it's the group doing it, or whether it's a outside management company, it's not free. There aren't any free lunches, right? It costs money to manage it. So what the benefit sometimes could be is if you go to a larger company, and, disclaimer, I serve as CEO for Somnia, but if you go to a large company, you could sometimes realize economies of scale. So med-mal is less, billing expenses are less, recruiting is less, and sometimes you could drive down the overhead expense. At the end of the day, I can only tell you what our philosophy is. I don't profess to be an expert at this publicly traded company or this conglomerate out there. I'm just not. We're not that kind of company. I just don't know. We always do a very formal analysis, and we always pay people a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. I don't know how the other companies do it. I don't read the blogs or whatever they say, but I don't think you could paint everybody with the same brush. And there are management companies that are publicly traded, a division of a conglomerate, owned by private equity guys, who have people in a boardroom in suits taking a look at shareholder return. I think that's where maybe sometimes you have to scratch your head a little bit, and you maybe, we have to see, but, there are other companies out there where, look, they could take some of those savings through economies of scales and redeploy it into quality initiatives, more coverage, perhaps more vacation, better benefits, whatever it may be. So I think it's the strategy of using a management company or not is neither a bad nor a good decision. It depends upon the unique situation at hand. If you do decide, however, a management company is the way to go, you can't paint them all with the same brush. You just can't, because they're not all cut alike. We're a privately held company. We're much smaller, and we just don't have the people leaning over our shoulders, looking down our backs and looking over. We can do things that many other organizations can't, but other organizations are the same way. So I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I'm just trying to say it's not such an easy deduction. Some of the larger, now, I don't want to come across like I'm besmirching the large multi-specialty management companies. The benefit to them is sometimes they take from Peter to pay Paul. So if you have a cash flow positive ER department, they'll take the positive proceeds and they'll use it to offset the anesthesia subsidy. They'll take the pediatric or ICU positive cash flow and they'll use it to defray the anesthesia subsidy. It's something the hospital has to go through. I mean, if it's a financial calculus and only a financial calculus, maybe that's the right decision. But maybe the operational impact of that decision leads to a poorly run ER department now and a poorly run anesthesia department, or a better run department. I don't know. I mean, I'm not these guys, so I don't know. This gentleman.
We have an arrangement with a private anesthesia group that provides excellent services. No issue, no problem, none. They are considering selling themselves to a private group.
Yeah.
And from a hospital point of view, what should we be concerned about? Questions asked? Those things.
You know, I'll tell you, I'll share my experiences with you because I think that'll be a good way to answer your question. Is our company worked with hospitals who, despite all those warning signs, they haven't been able to make it work. Things have reached high noon and things are pretty bleak. They're pretty bad. And I've had to put in 35 clinicians in 45 days at a hospital when they walked out. And I make my living running to the fires where everybody's running out of, and that's what I enjoy doing. Not all companies look at it the same way. Some of these companies out there acquire. You know, our organization never has acquired anybody, and it's not part of our strategic goal. We don't want to do it. My concern is that the physician practice models of the 80s and the 90s indicated that as you acquire practices, that the work ethic, the zeal to want to grow the practice, the zeal to want to do things to achieve a better outcome, sometimes goes a different direction once you've been acquired. I don't know if it'll prove out in the anesthesia space, I just don't know. But if you're an anesthesiologist and all of a sudden you get a $2 million check, you know, the zeal to get up at 5:30 in the morning because the surgeon wants to operate at 6 instead of 7, and the zeal to want to do these things, I don't know. Is it human nature? Maybe it won't be as fervent? Maybe?
What is the company buying?
It's the usual financial gimmickry. They pay X for the practice, and there's the they reduce the compensation of the providers to fair market value. They take the delta between fair market value comp and what they were getting paid. That flows down to their bottom line. Economies of scale with administrative inputs increases their bottom line. And then after they pay their note interest on their note on an ongoing basis, there's residual cash flow that flows to their bottom line. Now, that whole thing is predicated a lot of times on keeping that contract, right?
Right.
So, you know, that to me is the rubric to this all. As a group gets acquired, what will be the long-term manifestation of getting that big paycheck today, and how will that govern behavior tomorrow? And I just don't know. You know, clearly, and I'm guessing here because we don't acquire practices, and you know we're not in that game. You know, I would think that maybe those deals are structured with the current anesthesia group where there's some sort of incentive for them to do a good job and to keep that client, i.e. the hospital and the surgeons and the patients happy. I just don't know. You know, I'm just not as sanguine about some of the groups that have been acquired or that are being acquired about how this is going to play out. I just don't know. I mean, would you agree?
Well, yes, I would. I guess I'm thinking from our point of view. What, you know, in other words, our contract will break if they do that.
That's right, yeah.
We need to renegotiate.
That's right.
We're kind of worried that, well, what are our options? You know, we've got, 50 anesthesiologists, a big system, 60 anesthesiologists. If we say no to them, what kind of issues, are there quality issues associated with having these management companies come in? Such as yours?
It depends.
We have a very good relationship right now, that's our issue.
It's the same thing. You know, not all situations play out the same way. There are some acquisitions that go really well where after getting the $2 million paycheck, they want to get up at 5:30 in the morning, they want to work till 11 o'clock at night, taking call every other because 3 guys are out sick, not a big deal. I'm just having a hard time seeing how that will continue. I'm just a person trying to think of human nature about that. Some management companies put a heavy emphasis on quality management. In fact, many of them put a high emphasis on quality management. So I think management companies in general aren't a bad thing. They may certainly bring something to bear in terms of a better quality management program. So that could be a good thing, not a bad thing. I think as your contract comes up to renewal, I don't know what the parent company who acquired them, what sort of behavior will occur in the boardroom of the CEO. I just don't know. I think what it does do is it lends more credibility to just keep your eye on things earlier as you get closer to contract renewal. Because if you meet with the behemoth that acquired them, and it becomes a sort of high noon, discussion, you want to make sure you have options, for that. And that doesn't mean, even a company like mine, yeah, we run to the fires that everybody's running out of typically, but, you don't want to have to necessarily have a fire on your guard. So you probably want to start early, thinking it through and evaluating your options. And there's no harm in meeting with the group that's acquiring your practice and meeting with them and say what their plans are. What are your intentions? It may make you want to start this process a couple of years early to give yourself lead time. So you're not caught by surprise.